Tonight, in a Fox 8 investigation, we uncover lead levels in drinking water in some area schools higher than pediatricians recommend.
Yeah, Fox 8 scoured through dozens of pages of lead level testing results. Kimberly Kurth investigates.
We know Flint doesn't have the finances to be able to handle this or the resources.
Following the water crisis in Flint, Michigan.
I would certainly not bathe a newborn child or a young infant in this bad water.
The American Academy of Pediatrics called for stricter regulations for children's drinking water. They recommend that lead concentrations at school water fountains don't exceed 1 part per billion. The Academy says even at half the levels previously considered safe, growing evidence shows a child's exposure to lead can cause irreversible cognitive and behavioral problems.
Very low doses affect them, whereas it wouldn't affect us. So that is something we need to be concerned about. And then remember, this is something that accumulates. It accumulates in your body throughout your life.
A Fox 8 investigation found that some samples taken from local schools were higher than that 1 part per billion recommendation. Right now, school systems in Louisiana are not legally required to test for water lead levels unless they're on their own water system. That's because oftentimes the school system uses water from the city utility, and that utility's water must undergo both federal and state lead and copper monitoring. But the EPA offers guidance for school systems that choose to test for lead and recommends taking action whenever there are elevated lead water levels in schools. Jefferson Parish Public Schools spokesman Ted Beasley says they were proactive and hired a private company to do testing at 20 schools over the summer.
Obviously, I think it would always be best if there were 0 levels of lead. And I think in that test, 90% of the fountains they tested had 0 levels of lead.
Fox 8 obtained those results through a public records request and found a sample taken from a cafeteria water fountain at Mildred Harris Elementary came back at 23.3 parts per billion. Remember, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends lead levels don't exceed 1 part per billion.
Were parents notified about that elevated lead level?
Yeah, parents have been notified at Harris Elementary.
And should they be concerned about that level?
No, they shouldn't be concerned now because the problem's been taken care of. And then I think that was the only, if I remember correctly, that was the only fountain at the school that had the problem. So the water coming in, there's not a systemic problem. It was just in that one location.
While lead wasn't detected in most of the samples taken in the 20 Jefferson Parish public schools tested, water fountains at G.T. Woods Elementary, East Jefferson High, Phoebe Hurst Elementary, Ford Middle, Ellender Middle School, John Ehret High, West Jefferson High, and B.A. St. Bill Elementary all had samples that tested above the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation.
We were pleased with the results from the testing, but we know that we need to keep that going as well. I'd want parents to know that the safety of their student, that's our top responsibility.
Earlier this year, the legislature passed a law requiring the state health department test annually for lead in water at selected public elementary schools.
There's been a lot of concern about lead in drinking water since Flint, Michigan issues cropped up, and schools around the country who are now looking at their aging infrastructure are wondering, do they have lead in their water in their schools?
As part of a new pilot program, the Louisiana Department of Health tested 12 schools across the state built prior to 1986 that had no plumbing or water fountain changes since that time.
There are a lot of old schools in our state, obviously, and we want to know our children being exposed to lead when they don't need to be.
In our area, the state tested 5 schools. At Dwight D. Eisenhower Academy of Global Studies in New Orleans, a kitchen sample came back at 15 parts per billion. At Covington Elementary School, a kitchen sample showed a lead result of 12 parts per billion. And at a Harahan Elementary water fountain, the state found lead at 7 parts per billion. Guidry says while the results were better than expected, it doesn't mean there aren't problems.
But I think there are schools out there that may have this issue, so we really want to promote talking to school systems that they may want to look at their water in their schools because of the aging infrastructure, the aging buildings, the aging water fountains, so that they can rule out that this is a risk.
LSU health researcher Adrienne Katner has studied lead in New Orleans drinking water for years. She says the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation of 1 part per billion is very hard to achieve.
because NSF allows up to 5 parts per billion of lead to leach into the water from brass faucet fixtures. So some other people say 5 parts per billion might be a good thing to aim for. It might be more realistic than 1 part per billion.
And as our investigation continues Wednesday night at 9, we will have the results of lead and copper testing at a North Shore school and why those levels raise concern.